General Ulysses Simpson Grant, commanding all Union armies, was consulted by telegraph. His response was characteristically blunt. "The war is nearly won. These women saved soldiers' lives. Unless they directly aided Confederate military operations, I recommend clemency." Coming from Grant, whose armies had crushed Confederate resistance through relentless offensive action, this opinion carried immense weight. But Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt took the opposite view. In a memorandum to Stanton dated February 14th, Holt argued that failure to prosecute these women would establish precedent that individual conscience supersedes military authority. The entire structure of military discipline depends upon subordination of personal judgment to lawful orders. The 12 nurses remained in Alexandria, technically under guard but treated more as protected witnesses than prisoners. They'd been moved from a bare military barracks to more comfortable quarters in a requisitioned hotel. Elizabeth Harper had even been allowed to treat sick guards and officers, her medical skills too valuable to waste. On February 15th, Stanton interviewed each nurse individually. His conversations, recorded by his personal secretary, revealed his internal conflict. To Sarah Montgomery, he said, "You understand that officers died because soldiers deserted soldiers you helped escape." "Justice," Montgomery's response was unflinching. "And I understand that boys survived because we refused to let broken men be executed for having souls that war destroyed." Stanton spent longest with Rebecca Thompson, the youngest of the group at 26. She described the moment she'd decided to join the network. "I watched a surgeon at City Point Hospital refuse to treat a wounded Confederate prisoner. Said his supplies were for Union boys only. The prisoner died in agony. I realized then that I'd become a nurse to save lives, not to participate in selective mercy based on politics." The secretary probed the network's financing. Thompson revealed that several wealthy Northern women, including 2 senators' wives, had contributed funds through intermediaries. "They couldn't support us publicly, but they believed what we were doing was right. One told me, 'War makes beasts of men.' Someone must remember to be human." As Stanton prepared his recommendation for President Lincoln, he faced political calculations that extended beyond the nurses themselves. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. General William Tecumseh Sherman was cutting through the Carolinas. Grant had Petersburg under siege. Within months, perhaps weeks, the Confederacy would collapse. The question became, what kind of peace did America want? One that punished every deviation from military authority? Or one that acknowledged the moral complexities of a war that had torn the nation apart? Stanton's final report to Lincoln, submitted February 17th, remained sealed in the War Department files for decades. But its recommendation would determine whether 12 nurses who chose conscience over orders would face a firing squad or something else entirely. February 20th, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln sat in his office at the Executive Mansion, reading Secretary Stanton's report for the 3rd time. Outside, Washington City bustled with the energy of impending victory. Inside, Lincoln wrestled with a decision that would define how history remembered mercy during America's bloodiest conflict. The president had invited unusual counsel for this decision. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, known as Frederick Douglass, arrived at 4 in the afternoon. The former slave-turned-abolitionist leader had advised Lincoln throughout the war on matters of conscience and justice. Joining him was Clara Harlow Barton, who'd earned the nickname Angel of the Battlefield for her tireless work nursing Union wounded. "These 12 women did what I've done," Barton told Lincoln bluntly, "except they extended their mercy beyond the boundary of uniform. If that's criminal, Mr. President, then perhaps I've been a criminal too every time I've treated a wounded Confederate who fell into our hands." Douglass offered a different perspective. "Mr. President, the question isn't whether these women broke military law. Clearly they did. The question is whether military law should have required them to turn away from suffering simply because it wore the wrong color cloth." He paused, his powerful voice softening. "I spent years helping people break laws that said human beings could be property. Sometimes justice demands disobedience." Lincoln listened, then shared something that hadn't appeared in Stanton's report. His personal secretary, John Milton Hay, had conducted quiet interviews with families of executed deserters. "One mother in Ohio," Lincoln said, his voice heavy. Told Mr. Hay that her son was shot for desertion after he fled from Cold Harbor. The boy was 19. Had watched his entire company die in 15 minutes. When they executed him, she received a letter saying he'd been a coward, but she knew her son. Knew he'd simply broken. The president stood and walked to the window. I've signed execution orders for deserters. Believed it necessary to maintain discipline. But these nurses are asking me to consider whether we've been executing boys who were casualties of war just as surely as if they'd taken a bullet. On February 21st, Lincoln held a cabinet meeting. Attorney General James Speed argued for prosecution. Mr. President, if individual judgment supersedes military authority, we have anarchy. Secretary of State William Henry. Seward countered. And if military authority permits no space for mercy, we have tyranny. Postmaster General William Dennison noted practical concerns. The publicity around this case has made these womenfolk heroes. Prosecuting them might win legal principle but lose public support, particularly as we transition to peace. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Wells added his perspective. My son was wounded at Antietam. The surgeon who saved his life violated protocol to do it operated when regulations said the boy should wait for transport to a better hospital. I've never questioned whether that surgeon did right. These nurses faced similar choices. Lincoln requested one more piece of information. He wanted to meet the nurses themselves. On February 22, Washington's birthday, a coincidence not lost on anyone, the 12 women were brought to the executive mansion. The president spoke with each one privately. Sarah Montgomery described her father's abolitionist work and how it had taught her that law and justice sometimes diverge. Elizabeth Harper, at 43, the eldest and most experienced, told Lincoln about watching soldiers die needlessly. Not from wounds, Mr. President, but from despair, from souls crushed by horror. The Army didn't have language for it, so they called it cowardice. Martha Blackwell's conversation with Lincoln focused on the nature of desertion itself. Sir, we treated men from both armies. Some had deserted because they were cowards, I won't deny that, but most? They'd given everything they had. Their courage wasn't infinite, it ran out like ammunition or rations. Should we execute a soldier who runs out of courage any more than one who runs out of bullets? Rebecca Thompson, youngest of the group, asked Lincoln a question that left him visibly shaken. Mr. President, when this war ends and we count our dead, will we count only those killed by enemy bullets? Or will we count the boys we executed, the men who took their own lives, the soldiers whose minds never recovered? Because if we count all of them, sir, the number becomes almost unbearable. Lincoln spent 30 minutes with the nurses collectively, asking about their medical work, their faith, their understanding of duty. As they prepared to leave, he made an observation. You remind me, he said, that mercy is not weakness. That sometimes the hardest thing and the bravest thing is to refuse to let circumstances make monsters of us. On February 24th, Lincoln issued his decision in a confidential memorandum to Secretary Stanton. The document wouldn't be made public until after the president's death, but its contents were clear. The 12 nurses would not face military prosecution. Instead, they would be discharged from military service without honor, but also without dishonor, administrative limbo that acknowledged wrongdoing without punishing mercy. More significantly, Lincoln ordered a comprehensive review of executions for desertion, particularly cases involving soldiers with documented psychological trauma. He also directed the Surgeon General to study what the nurses called soldiers' heart, with intent to better understand and treat it. The decision satisfied no one completely. Radical Republicans saw it as too lenient. Some military commanders viewed it as undermining discipline. But Lincoln, in his memorandum, explained his reasoning. As we emerge from this terrible war, we must decide what kind of nation we will be. One that punishes every technical violation of law? Or one that acknowledges that extraordinary circumstances sometimes demand extraordinary mercy? These women chose mercy. I cannot bring myself to punish them for it. On March 1, 1865, the 12 nurses were released from military custody. Their fate and the network they'd built would remain largely unknown for another 50 years. March 3, 1865, the 12 nurses left Alexandria quietly, each departing for different destinations. The War Department had made clear that public silence about their case was expected, though not legally mandated. As the Civil War lurched toward its final bloody conclusion, their story faded from newspapers, replaced by accounts of Sherman's march and Grant's siege of Petersburg. Sarah Montgomery returned to Boston, where she lived with her father until his death in 1872. She never married, dedicating her life instead to establishing training programs for nurses that emphasized psychological care alongside physical treatment. According to records preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, she wrote extensively in private journals about her experiences but never published them, honoring her agreement with the War Department. Elizabeth Harper settled in Philadelphia, where she worked at Pennsylvania Hospital until 1880. Her specialty became treating veterans suffering from what doctors were beginning to call nostalgia, or soldier's heart, the psychological wounds that wouldn't heal. She corresponded regularly with other members of the network, letters that survive today in the National Library of Medicine collections. Martha Blackwell moved to Ohio and married a former Union officer who'd lost his left arm at Shiloh. Together they operated a small farm and raised 4 children. Her husband, Captain Robert James Sullivan, had been one of the officers who'd quietly referred soldiers to the network, a connection they kept private for decades. Rebecca Thompson, the youngest, moved west to California in 1868. She worked as a traveling nurse in mining communities, areas where medical care was scarce and questions about one's past were rarely asked. She died in 1894 in San Francisco, her Civil War service unknown to her neighbors. The network itself dissolved slowly. The Quaker families who'd supported it returned to their farms and meetings, their role in protecting deserters unacknowledged. Josiah Pemberton, the farmer who'd started it all by hiding a wounded Confederate boy, lived until 1903, dying at age 87 without ever speaking publicly about his wartime activities. President Lincoln's order for a comprehensive study of psychological trauma in soldiers produced limited immediate results. Dr. Jacob Mendes Da Costa published a paper in January 1867 describing what he called Da Costa's syndrome, a condition affecting Civil War veterans with symptoms including rapid heartbeat, anxiety, and inability to tolerate stress. His work drew partially on notes that Elizabeth Harper had shared confidentially with military physicians. The barn outside Richmond where the nurses were found was torn down in 1867. Local farmers salvaged the lumber. No marker indicated what had occurred there. The site is today covered by a shopping center, its history unknown to those who park there. The political dimensions of the case faded quickly. Lincoln's assassination on April 14, 1865, just 6 weeks after releasing the nurses, meant his memorandum on their case remained classified. Secretary Stanton, consumed by pursuing Lincoln's assassins and managing Reconstruction, never revisited the matter publicly. The soldiers saved by the network scattered across America. Some returned to their homes and families, carrying secrets about how they'd survived. Others moved west, seeking anonymity in territories where questions about war service went unasked. A few became prominent citizens. At least 3 former patients served in state legislatures, and 1 became a federal judge, but none publicly acknowledged the network that had saved them. The true story remained hidden for 53 years. In 1918, as America entered the First World War, a historian named Margaret Ann Fletcher began researching Civil War medical practices. In the National Archives, she discovered Captain Harrison's investigation report, unsealed after the 50-year classification period expired. Fletcher's book, The Deserters' Hospital, Mercy Beyond Battle Lines, published in 1921, finally told the complete story. By then, all 12 nurses had died. The last survivor, Martha Blackwell Sullivan, had passed away in 1913 at age 74. The book created scholarly debate. Some historians viewed the nurses as heroes ahead of their time. Others criticized them for undermining military discipline during the nation's greatest crisis. The debate itself reflected broader questions about the First World War, questions about shell shock, about the limits of courage, about what societies owed soldiers broken by combat. During the Second World War, military psychiatrists studying combat trauma rediscovered the work of Elizabeth Harper and the observations recorded in the network's medical logs. Her notes on moral injury and soul wounds influenced the development of combat stress treatment protocols that saved countless lives in that conflict and beyond. In 1978, the Department of Defense commissioned a study on the treatment of desertion throughout American military history. The case of the 12 nurses received detailed analysis. The study concluded that their medical observations about psychological trauma had been decades ahead of contemporary military medicine and that their patient survival rates exceeded standards of the period by significant margins. Today, a small memorial stands in Alexandria National Cemetery. Dedicated in 2006, it honors Civil War nurses who served beyond the boundaries of armies. The names of the 12 women are engraved there, along with the phrase Sarah Montgomery wrote in her final journal entry before her death in 1889. We chose to remember that beneath every uniform beat a human heart, capable of breaking. The medical records they maintained detailed observations of 618 cases are now preserved in climate-controlled archives, studied by military historians and medical researchers. Their documentation of psychological trauma remains relevant to understanding post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury in veterans. The barn may be gone, its location forgotten by all but historians with old maps. But the question the 12 nurses forced America to confront remains painfully current. When military necessity and human mercy collide, where does duty truly lie? There. Staff Sergeant Raymond "Red" McCluskey had been tracking him with patient discipline. McCluskey's burst lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but at the 109's crossing angle and the top turret's slight elevation advantage, those rounds walked through the fighter's cockpit and engine section with devastating effect. The Messerschmitt rolled onto its back, trailing coolant vapor and fuel mist, then nosed over into a vertical dive that would terminate somewhere in the German countryside below. Whether the pilot survived to pull out remained unknowable, but intelligence services would later credit this as a probable kill and attribute it to Arnautucci's crossfire coordination, despite McCluskey firing the actual fatal rounds. Technical Sergeant William Bradford, Maiden's Prayer's flight engineer monitoring combat from his position near the top turret, would later testify during the intelligence debriefing that he'd observed something extraordinary during this phase of the engagement. The German fighters, he reported, began attacking with noticeably less aggression, breaking off runs earlier than doctrine suggested and maintaining greater standoff distances. This behavioral shift, subtle but measurable, suggested that Arnautucci's tactic had achieved something beyond physical destruction. It had injected uncertainty into an enemy that had grown accustomed to dominating the air battles over occupied Europe. The 4th and 5th kills came almost simultaneously, a piece of coordination that pushed the limits of credibility and would later require gun camera footage, sadly not available from ball turret positions, to verify through alternative sources. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s approached from opposite beam positions at 1400 hours and 3 minutes, a classic pincer attack that exploited the B-17's fundamental vulnerability. No bomber gunner could effectively engage threats from both sides simultaneously, and standard defensive doctrine relied on multiple gunners coordinating their sector responsibilities to provide overlapping coverage. With Maiden's Prayer's port-waist gun position out of action and Romano struggling to clear his jammed starboard gun, the pincer should have succeeded. Arnautucci made a decision that defied both physics and common sense. Instead of choosing one threat to engage while accepting hits from the other, he fired his signal burst and then did something no ball turret gunner had attempted in recorded combat history. He initiated a continuous rotation at maximum traverse speed, oscillating between the 2 attacking fighters in a figure-8 tracking pattern that brought his guns to bear on each threat for approximately 1.5 seconds before swinging to the opposite target. The tactic was theoretically suicidal. Splitting attention between 2 targets meant inadequate time on either to achieve accurate fire, and the ball turret's traverse motors, while reasonably fast, weren't designed for this kind of rapid back-and-forth movement. Worse still, the constant rotation introduced additional variables into ballistic calculations. The gunner was now tracking moving targets while himself moving, creating a compound motion problem that would challenge professional mathematicians let alone a combat gunner operating on instinct and adrenaline. But Arnautucci wasn't trying to shoot down both fighters with his own fire. He was creating the illusion of coordinated defense, making each pilot believe that concentrated crossfire was about to materialize from multiple positions. The port-side Focke-Wulf pilot, seeing tracers flash toward him from the ball turret, assumed the non-functional waist gun was about to add its fire. Why else would the ball turret engage him instead of the starboard threat? The starboard side pilot, observing the same pattern, made the identical assumption about Romano's jammed gun. Both pilots broke off their attacks within half a second of each other, unwilling to press through what they perceived as coordinated defensive fire. And in breaking off, they made the fundamental mistake that killed them. They each turned toward the opposite beam, attempting to gain separation from the bomber's defensive fire by changing their attack axis. Those turns brought both fighters into the sighting cone of McCluskey's top turret, which commanded a wide field of fire across both beams when targets presented themselves at the correct angles and distances. McCluskey, a former competitive trap shooter from Montana who'd won state championships before the war, possessed the rare ability to track multiple moving targets simultaneously and calculate firing solutions with intuitive speed. He'd been following both Focke-Wulfs, waiting for the moment when their flight paths brought them into his range at manageable deflection angles. When both fighters turned toward opposite beams simultaneously, he made a split-second choice that would become legend in the squadron. He fired a long burst at the portside fighter, destroyed it with hits to the engine and cockpit, then traversed his turret in a smooth arc and engaged the starboard fighter before it could complete its turn, scoring critical hits that sent it spiraling downward, trailing black smoke. 10 minutes into the running battle, though it felt like hours to the men inside, Maiden's Prayer's aluminum fuselage, the bomber had expended nearly 60% of its ammunition, suffered additional battle damage that had the flight engineer and pilot negotiating a careful balance between airspeed and altitude loss, and pushed its crew to the edge of physical collapse. The body's response to sustained combat stress at high altitude combined multiple physiological crises, adrenaline flooding the bloodstream while oxygen-deprived tissues struggled to function, extreme cold-numbing extremities while exertion produced sweat that froze in clothing layers, and the cognitive load of maintaining tactical awareness while death approached from multiple vectors at supersonic velocities. Arnautucci's hands shook violently enough that he could see them trembling even through his heavy gloves. His back muscles, compressed into the ball turret's fetal position for nearly 6 hours counting the outbound flight and combat time, screamed with cramps that threatened to lock his body into immobility. The optical sight's eyepiece had left a pressure bruise around his eye socket that would darken into a spectacular black eye over the coming days. He'd lost sensation in his feet 20 minutes earlier, a dangerous sign of frostbite progression that he couldn't address until they landed, assuming they landed. But the German attacks had lost their coordinated ferocity. What had been disciplined assault waves had degraded into opportunistic individual passes, fighters darting in from extreme range, firing quick bursts, then breaking away without pressing attacks home. Intelligence analysts would later attribute this shift to typical Luftwaffe tactical doctrine fighters broke off combat when fuel reserves dropped to predetermined minimums, refusing to risk running dry over hostile territory. But Lieutenant Harrington, observing from the pilot's seat with the broader perspective his position afforded, recognized something additional. The German pilots had grown cautious. The sixth confirmed kill emerged from this new pattern of cautious probing. A lone Messerschmitt Bf 109, perhaps flown by a younger pilot trying to prove himself, or simply less influenced by the cautionary destruction his comrades had witnessed, committed to a classic stern attack. Tail gunner Kowalski, fighting through pain from his wounds and the morphine dulling his senses, tracked the fighter with determination but struggled to lead the target adequately. His tracers consistently fell behind the approaching 109, close enough to force minor corrections, but not achieving hits. Arnautucci rotated his turret to support the tail defense, adding his fire to Kowalski's in a more conventional mutual support pattern, no crossfire coordination. Just two gunners hammering away at a single target from different positions. But the 109 pilot, having observed the previous crossfire kills, interpreted this standard defensive pattern as the prelude to another coordinated trap. He broke off his attack and dove away with such abrupt violence that he over-controlled his aircraft, inducing a high-speed stall that sent the fighter tumbling through several uncontrolled rotations before the pilot recovered. That recovery maneuver, necessary to regain controlled flight, required the pilot to trade altitude for airspeed. He nosed over into a steep dive that accelerated the fighter beyond safe speeds. Standard Messerschmitt recovery procedure from such a dive called for gradual back pressure on the control stick, allowing airspeed to bleed off while maintaining positive control. But this pilot, whether panicked by his loss of control or insufficiently trained in recovery procedures, pulled back too aggressively. The 109's impinged the tail assembly that provided stability and control experienced loads beyond its design limits. The vertical stabilizer attachment failed, and the entire tail assembly separated from the fuselage in a catastrophic structural failure. The fighter entered a flat spin, impossible to recover without tail control surfaces, and spiraled toward the German countryside below. Whether this counted as a legitimate combat kill sparked debate during the debriefing. Arnautucci and Kowalski hadn't actually shot the fighter down in the conventional sense. But 8th Air Force intelligence rules credited kills when defensive fire directly caused enemy aircraft destruction through any mechanism, including induced pilot error and structural failures resulting from evasive maneuvering. The 7th kill came as Maiden's Prayer approached the relative safety of Allied-controlled airspace, with the North Sea's gray expanse visible through broken clouds and the German fighters finally breaking off their attacks to preserve fuel for the journey home. A final Focke-Wulf, either bolder or more desperate than his comrades, made one last high-speed pass from directly ahead a head-on attack that pitted the fighter's cannons against the bomber's forward-firing guns in a deadly game of chicken, where closure rates exceeded 600 miles per hour. Co-pilot 2nd Lieutenant James Donnelly, manning the nose gun after the bombardier's death, opened fire at maximum range, his tracers arcing toward the approaching fighter in streams that grew closer as the distance closed. Arnautucci, recognizing the attack geometry, rotated his turret to fire upward through the Focke-Wulf's predicted flight path, adding his guns to the defensive fire despite the unconventional angle. The combined fire, more volume than accuracy at that closure rate, created a cone of rounds that the German pilot chose not to penetrate. He broke left, passing within 200 feet of the bomber's nose close enough that crew members would later report seeing the pilot's white scarf and leather helmet through the canopy. That brake maneuver took the Focke-Wulf directly across the firing cone of the top turret, where McCluskey had been tracking the fighter with patient anticipation. The 190 flew into a burst that lasted perhaps 1 second but concentrated sufficient rounds into its right wing, route to sever hydraulic lines and damage the main spar. The wing didn't separate immediately, but the structural compromise became evident as the fighter attempted to roll right. The control surfaces responded sluggishly. The wing began flexing in ways that threatened imminent failure, and the pilot wisely abandoned his aircraft, canopy separating and the dark figure of the airman tumbling clear before his parachute bloomed white against the gray sky. Maiden's Prayer crossed into Allied airspace at 1400 hours and 17 minutes, having survived an engagement that had destroyed or damaged 7 German fighters in approximately 5 minutes of intense combat. The bomber landed at Thorpe Abbotts 90 minutes later, one engine silent, hydraulic systems compromised, and the airframe bearing 214 separate holes from flak fragments and fighter guns. Maintenance crews would require 3 weeks to restore the aircraft to operational status. The intelligence debriefing lasted 4 hours, with officers from both Squadron Intelligence and 8th Air Force Headquarters in attendance. Initial skepticism about the claimed kill numbers 7, confirmed in such a short period, exceeded any previous single bomber. Defensive record gave way to stunned acceptance as corroborating evidence accumulated. McCluskey's account matched Arnautucci's perfectly, Romano and the flight engineer provided supporting details, and even the wounded tail gunner, Kowalski, confirmed the essential facts through his morphine haze. The crossfire tactic itself generated immediate controversy. Senior officers recognized its effectiveness but worried about the risks, potential for friendly fire incidents, violation of established sector defense doctrine, and the extraordinary level of crew coordination required. Colonel LeMay, after reviewing the debriefing transcripts and personally interviewing Arnautucci, made a characteristically pragmatic decision. The tactic would be taught as an emergency procedure to be employed only in desperate circumstances, with intensive training required before crews could implement it, and with clear understanding that gunners attempting crossfire coordination without proper preparation risked court-martial for reckless endangerment. Arnautucci received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor, in a ceremony held at Thorpe Abbotts on the 5th of April, 1943. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and exceptional tactical innovation, resulting in the destruction of multiple enemy aircraft and the preservation of his crew's lives. Romano, McCluskey, and Kowalski received distinguished flying crosses for their roles in the engagement. But perhaps the most telling measure of the tactic's impact came from German fighter units operating over Western Europe. Luftwaffe intelligence had pieced together details of the engagement through pilot debriefings and radio intercepts, and by mid-March, fighter commanders began warning their pilots about American bombers employing coordinated crossfire techniques. The psychological effect rippled through German tactical doctrine. Attack approaches became more cautious, break-off distances increased, and the Luftwaffe's effectiveness against B-17 formations declined measurably in the months following the Bremen raid. Staff Sergeant Michael Arnautucci completed his required 25 combat missions in August 1943 and returned to the United States, where he spent the remainder of the war training new gunners in the crossfire coordination technique he'd pioneered. He survived the war, married a nurse he'd met during his stateside assignment, and returned to Brooklyn, where he took over his father's automotive repair business. He rarely spoke of his combat experiences except to say that survival demanded seeing connections. Others missed a lesson learned in his father's garage that had somehow translated into 5 minutes of mathematical violence 23,000 feet above Nazi Germany. The stupid crossfire trick, as Arnautucci himself had called it during that first experimental discussion with Romano, entered official Army Air Force's tactical doctrine in revised form by late 1943, contributing to the 8th Air Force's eventual achievement of air superiority over occupied Europe and helping thousands of airmen survive missions over the Third Reich's increasingly desperate defenses.